So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So from this lecture, we'll move on to certain selected passages which we'll examine in some details, because I think we've discussed at length the cultural context of a novel, the narrative politics in a novel to a large extent. So we now move into certain sections which are important and relevant for us for the purpose of examining the novel more clearly and more complexly. Now, today we're going to move to who is probably the most important character in the novel, Colonel Kurtz, who never really appears in the novel except as some kind of a ghostly presence. And the ghostly quality, the spectral quality about Kurtz is actually very, very important. He's a shadowy figure in Heart of Darkness. He's never really fleshed out as a character. But that is part of the centerlessness in Heart of Darkness, that the most important character, or rather the entire novel is about Kurtz, is about finding Kurtz. But he never appears in the proper sense of the word. He just appears in a very, very translucent manner, and then it disappears. So he appears and then it dies very, very quickly. But the entire novel is about him. So one can look at Kurtz less as a character and more as a symptom in Heart of Darkness. So he's a symptom of imperialism. He's what imperialism does to you as a white person. So he becomes an example, a symbolic symptom of imperialism and the excesses of imperialism. So he embodies the excesses of imperialism. He's someone who's become the monster of imperialism. But we are told constantly that he is a perfect agent too. He was someone who was trained by Europe, someone who was engineered by the entire imperial machinery of Europe, and then sent off to control the colonies. So he's essentially the machine gone wrong, or the machine turning rogue. So he's like a rogue agent that is seen in spy cinema. So the rogue quality in Kurtz, the fact that it turns against the institution that had created him, is important. And again, that is very relevant to some of the geopolitical tensions we have in the world today. So as I keep telling you, Heart of Darkness is very relevant and very topical and very resonant with some of the geopolitical issues we have in the world today, in the Middle East issues, Iraq issues, foreign policies of the white Western world, not least USA. So Heart of Darkness is about that, the complexity, the complications that come, the human complications, the political complications that arise when you territorialize a non-white space, where you territorialize a space through military machinery, through imperial machinery, etc. Right, so Kurtz could be read as a symptom, could be read as a symptom of excess, but he's very much a shadowy, spectral character. He's a spectre in Heart of Darkness. He's a ghost in Heart of Darkness. It never really appears, but his entire novel is about him. So he is a center in Heart of Darkness who's also not a center, right? So the shadowy quality, the spectral quality of the center in Heart of Darkness, it contributes to the centerlessness that the entire novel embodies in its narrative politics. Now, interestingly, the first time there's a mention of Kurtz, he's mentioned in a very indirect way, right? And the first allusion to Kurtz, the first reference to Kurtz in Heart of Darkness is through a painting, something that he had painted some time ago that Marlow spots on the wall. And then that's the first reference to Colonel Kurtz. And then he says, and this should be on the screen, where Marlow says, "Then I notice a small sketch in oils on a panel representing a woman draped and blindfolded, carrying a lighted torch. The background was somber, almost black. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister." So if we look at the adjectives, interestingly, sinister obviously is what stands out as the end, is something evil and dark about that face, but also stately and somber, almost black. So there's a lot of spectral quality about this painting. And that spectrality in the painting anticipates the spectrality that is embodied by Kurtz eventually in the novel. So we see Kurtz first as true representation made by him, right? So that's an interesting way to represent something, through another representation. So the first piece of characterization about Kurtz in Heart of Darkness is through a painting. It's focalized through an artwork that he had presumably drawn some time ago. So the whole idea of drawing a woman carrying a lighted torch, but also being blindfolded, so that has an ambivalence to it as well. So the lighted torch traditionally and stereotypically symbolizes progress, enlightenment, knowledge, etc. But at the same time, we also see that the woman who is carrying the torch is draped and blindfolded. So there's a degree of blindness about the knowledge. And this is what I mean this is what I meant when I said at the very beginning of Heart of Darkness, that the enlightenment in Heart of Darkness is a negative enlightenment. The illumination is a negative illumination. So the only knowledge that you get in Heart of Darkness is that of, non-illumination instead of darkness, right? So the only knowledge is dark knowledge. So the lighted torch becomes a symbol of knowledge, but at the same time, the person embodying that knowledge is blindfolded. So there's a degree of blindness and darkness about the knowledge, which is important for us to understand. And like I said, if you look at the adjectives closely, the movement was stately and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister. There's something almost cinematic about this particular image. If you look at the visual politics, there's a lot of light and half-light that is played over here. And the photoplay is important because the photoplay generates the spectral sinister effect over here. Right? So in that sense, this particular painting is very symbolic because A, it represents Kurtz, and B, it represents entire ambivalence around imperialism. So the whole mission of imperialism, as is popularly consumed as being a civilizing mission, as being an enlightening mission, that very figure of enlightenment and civilization is blindfolded away here. So the blindness and the insight, they come together and it creates a blindness of insight. So the only insight that you get in Heart of Darkness is one of darkness, is one of blindness, which is something which is represented by this figure, who is ironically, appropriately sketched by Colonel Kurtz, who is perhaps the most perfect example of the symptom of imperialism. What does imperialism do to you existentially? The almost pathological quality of imperialism in a way that it consumes you as a person, it consumes you existentially, right? So we talked about the slightly cannibalistic quality of imperialism as well, that it eats you up. Okay. So the painting is important, and it's a very, very political painting as well, as I hope you've established by now. It arrested me, and it stood by civilly, holding an empty half-pint champagne bottle, medical comforts, with a candle stuck in it. To my question, he said Mr. Kurtz had painted this in this very station more than a year ago, while waiting for means to go to his trading post. So the first reference to Kurtz over here. And then Marlow says, "Tell me, pray," said I, "who is this Mr. Kurtz?" So Marlow keeps hearing about Kurtz all the time through different figures. But now the first real description of Kurtz appears in Heart of Darkness over here. So we're told that, and Marlow is obviously relaying the information to us. And the relay of information is important because it sort of replicates, to a certain extent, the relay of information in colonial signposts, where information would come through telecommunications, so telegrams, telephones, through different kinds of signposts. So that too had a relay system. They had a sort of a conveyor belt relay system, which is the way we consume information as well as readers in Heart of Darkness. So tell me, pray, said I, who is this Mr. Kurtz? The chief of the inner station, he answered in a short tone, looking away. Much obliged, I said, laughing, and you're the brick maker of the central station. Everyone knows that. Now, before I move any further, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about and sort of unpacking this one sentence, the chief of the inner station. Now, literally and physically, the inner station would be the most innermost signpost of the empire. Right? And this is obviously the Belgian Empire, the Belgian colony in Congo, and Kurtz happens to be the controller or the master of the inner station. The innermost station is something which is inhabited and controlled by Kurtz. But we can also do a psychological reading of this, and there are lots of very complex and sophisticated and elegant psychoanalytic readings of Heart of Darkness, which one very tempting reading out of that would be to look at Kurtz as the innermost subconscious of imperialism. So if you look at the entire machinery of imperialism through a psychological structure, Kurtz inhabits the innermost psychological structure of imperialism, which is the darkest structure, the most guilty structure, the most ambivalent structure, the most complex structure. So the chief of the inner station can be read in either way. It could be the physical reading, the literal reading of the master of the innermost colonial station, which controls the colonial machinery of Congo. And more temptingly, and perhaps more psychologically, it could also be the innermost subconscious that is inhabited by Kurtz. Right? So in that Freudian psychoanalytic reading, Kurtz becomes the id, so to say, of imperialism. This id, ego, superego thing. So he becomes the innermost layer of that subconscious that is controlling imperialism. So, presumably he's the darkest point of imperialism. Yeah, and Marlow obviously responds to this in a flippant way and says, and you are the brick maker of the central station. Everyone knows that. He was silent for a while. He's a prodigy, he said at last. He's an emissary of pity and science and progress and devil knows what else. We want, he began to declaim suddenly, for the guidance of the cause entrusted to us by Europe, so to speak, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. Right? So the whole idea of Kurtz being, we already see he's a bit of a painter as well, but then he's also described as being an emissary of science and progress. But then also notice the way in which this presumably positive epithet, or series of epithets, very, very positive epithets, pity, science, and progress, is also described. It also continued by this phrase, and devil knows what else, which is obviously a very dark, sinister kind of a way to describe something. Devil knows what else. So he's a prodigy, he's an enlightened person, he's a genius, he's an embodiment of pity and science and progress, but devil knows what else. So, science, pity, progress are normally Christian qualities according to this Eurocentric Enlightenment logic. But the whole illusion of devil over here complicates that narrative to a certain extent. We want, for the guidance of the cause entrusted to us by Europe, so to speak, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. Who says that, I asked. Lots of them, he replied. Some even write that. So he comes here, a special being, and as he ought to know. Why ought I to know? I interrupted, really surprised. He paid no attention. Yes, today he is the chief of the best station. Next year he'll be an assistant manager. 2 years more, but I dare say you know what he will be in 2 years' time. You are the new gang, the gang of virtue. The same people who sent him specially also recommended you. Oh, don't say no, I've seen my own eyes to trust. So, and Marlow becomes part of the continuity of this narrative. So this person is telling him that the same people who sent Kurtz sent you. So you're part of the virtue narrative of imperialism, right? You're part of the value narrative, the value-added narrative of imperialism, which looks at imperialism as a noble, value-added, virtuous mission. Okay. Light dawned upon me. My dear aunt's influential acquaintances were producing an unexpected effect upon the young man. I nearly burst into a laugh. Do you read the company's confidential correspondence? I asked. He hadn't a word to say. It was great fun. When Mr. Kurtz, I continued severely, is the general manager, you won't have the opportunity. Okay, now, the first the whole idea of Kurtz being the emissary of Europe, or the emissary of Europe in Enlightenment and imperialism is interesting over here, because when we get to see Kurtz, when we get closer to Kurtz, we never get to see him, but we get closer and closer to Kurtz. And obviously it's very cinematic, the whole thing. It's almost like Marlow is moving in with a movie camera and then describing everything around us without knowing what it is. So it's like a movie camera recording everything without interpreting anything, because he's a very bad interpreter. As you've seen already, he's a very unreliable narrator. He doesn't quite know what's happening around him. He just records everything and relays it back to us. So in that sense, Heart of Darkness is a very cinematic narrative. And as I mentioned to you before in one of the earlier lectures about this text, that there's a lot of films made in Heart of Darkness, the most famous among which would be Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, which is about the Vietnam War. And this American agent who goes rogue, the best American agent played in the film by Marlon Brando, is called Kurtz, and the novelist in that film as well. And he's the person who is assassinated in the end, because he becomes a problem for the entire machinery which had created them in the first place historically. And again, the whole idea of the white imperial machinery of creating an agent who then turns rogue, who then becomes a problem for that machinery and has to be disposed of. It's a very familiar narrative today as well in different geopolitical settings that we see today. So, the whole politics of terrorism, the whole politics of geopolitical territorialization, it often has these kind of markers, the whole idea of creating an agent, the best agent who is trained by the white imperial machinery and then turns against the machinery and then becomes a problem, classified as a terrorist, etc. So, in that sense, Heart of Darkness is one of the early. It seems to anticipate some of the current geopolitical tensions that we experience today in an increasingly globalized world. Okay, now let's just move on and see, take a look at the entire atmosphere in Heart of Darkness and how the entire atmosphere is described to us. in very, very visceral terms. And now we see this whole idea of the fence. Beyond the fence, this should be on the screen, beyond the fence, the forest stood up spectrally in the moonlight, and through that dim star, through the faint sounds of that lamentable courtyard, the silence of the land went home to one's very heart. Its mystery is greatness. So again, look at the spectrality. The word spectral is actually given to us over here. The ghostly quality, and by spectral, obviously what is meant is an ambivalent location between the real and the unreal. So the spectral is somewhere in between. It's a liminal landscape between the real and the unreal. So again, even the landscape is liminal in quality. Even the landscape is ambivalent in quality, and that ambivalence is something which is atmospheric over here. Okay. Its mystery is greatness, the amazing reality of its concealed life. The hurt nigger moaned feebly somewhere nearby. So again, the word nigger appears in Heart of Darkness. It's obviously a banned word today. And this is what I mean when I said at the beginning of this novel that the reason why this is such an important, relevant novel to us today is perhaps precisely because of its political incorrectness. It doesn't want to conceal its political incorrectness. So it's very politically incorrect. It's quite racist in its descriptions of the non-white person. Almost no non-white person speaks in Heart of Darkness, and even the landscape is exoticized, and then everything is focalized through a white man's lens, through a white man's perspective. All that's there. But that actually contributes to the ambivalence generated by Heart of Darkness. It doesn't glamorize imperialism. It doesn't make imperialism into a heroic enterprise. It does ask some very deep and dark questions about the nature and quality of imperialism as a machinery, and it takes away the entire glamour, the noble glamour or the virtue glamour out of imperialism, and experiences that as a very exploitative machinery, as an exploitative enterprise. It just looks at it the way it really is historically. Okay, and the whole idea of this person preparing Marlow for Kurtz is interesting because Kurtz, as I mentioned, never really appears in Heart of Darkness. He's talked about all the time. He's very much a third-person presence, and the person talked about. And that actually informs his spectrality. He never really appears directly. Now, interestingly, Marlow describes this particular person who's some kind of an accountant that he's talking to. I let him run on this papier-mac Mephistopheles. It's almost like a paperman. It's almost something mannequinish about this person, and this mannequin-like quality about this person is important. It seemed to me that if I tried, I could poke my forefinger through him and would find nothing inside but a little loose dirt, maybe. Okay, and this is, if you remember, the point in which we stopped the last lecture. We talked about the hollowness in Heart of Darkness. The centerlessness of Heart of Darkness is part of the hollowness, and that hollowness informs even the characters. So this particular person, this accountant person, he goes on relentlessly talking about Kurtz, and then Marlow has a feeling that if I poke my finger into his body, he'll just crumble and fall because there is no center holding him. And again, that's part of the centerlessness in Heart of Darkness that we see all the time. Nothing but a little loose dirt, maybe. He, don't you see, had been planning to be assistant manager by and under this present man, and I could see that coming of that Kurtz had upset him, both not a little. He talked precipitately, and I did not try to stop him. I had my shoulders against the wreck of my steamer, hauled up on the slope like a carcass of some big river animal. The smell of mud, of permeable mud, by Jove, was in my nostrils. The high stillness of the permeable forest was before my eyes. There were shiny patches on the black creek. So again, look at the immobility, the immutable quality of the forest around Marlow. And again, this atmospheric ambivalence about the forest. It doesn't quite know what things are. It can't quite create a cognitive landscape around him. So it's like a non-cognitive or pre-cognitive landscape around Marlow. It doesn't quite know what things are. Right? And the river, interestingly, is described in very mystical terms, very psychological terms. So the landscape in Heart of Darkness is very exoticized. It's entirely done through white man's eyes. It takes away the reality of the Congo landscape. It takes away the reality of the African landscape. But at the same time, there's a degree of psychologization about this landscape. And there's a lot of psychological investment in this landscape, which makes it more mystical or cryptic, cognitively cryptic, to a large extent. Okay. So, and then he moves on, and this particular passage which we'll see at the moment, he talks about Kurtz all the time, and then there's really a frustration about Marlow as well in terms of grappling with who Kurtz is, right? And that frustration is spilled over outside the narrative frame as well, in the sense that it comes to us as well. That we as readers are getting frustrated. We want to know, we want to have more information on Kurtz. We want to have more centered information on Kurtz, but we don't get that. And among other things, Heart of Darkness is essentially about the absence of information. It's about the annihilation of information. And that's a very important thing, because the entire machinery of imperialism relied on information, right? So it was an informative machinery. It was an information economy which had to be generated in order for imperialism to flourish and prosper. But then this entire annihilation of information, entire crisis of information, is part of the crisis of imperialism in Heart of Darkness, that we don't get any information at all. Even as readers, we keep looking at Marlow to supply us more data about Kurtz, and no data comes. And this is what he says over here. I had a notion it somehow would be helped to that Kurtz, whom at that time I did not see. You understand? He was just a word for me. So Kurtz was just a word for me. That's what Marlow says. I did not see the man in the name any more than you do. Do you see him? Do you see the story? Do you see anything? It seems to me I'm trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt, because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise, and bewilderment, in the tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible, which is of the very essence of dreams. So, and then he goes on and says, he was silent for a while. No, it is impossible. It is impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. It is impossible. We live as we dream alone. So I'll stop at this point today, but I'll just go back and unpack this a bit. And just to give you a reference, if you want a more complex understanding of what's happening here, I mean, this might be beyond the scope of this particular course, but if you're interested, I have a paper, a published paper on Heart of Darkness. If you Google me up, it will appear and you can download it for free. It is actually called Do You See the Story? So I take that title by quoting Marlow, which is from the previous page. This, do you see the story? Do you see anything? That last line on this page on your screen now. So if you just type my name, Abhishek Pari, in Google and Heart of Darkness, this should show up. And in that paper, I argue that the entire novel, Heart of Darkness, is about narrative crisis. I mean, I just talked about information crisis. There's no information at all available. But it's also about narrative crisis. Marlow doesn't quite know how to put his experience into a story. And that narrative crisis almost becomes a medical condition in Heart of Darkness. The fact that I can't tell you the story. I can't tell you what happened to me in Congo. I experienced it. It affected me deeply. It impacted me deeply, existentially. It changed me forever. But when I've come back to tell you the story, I can't tell you the story because I can't put that experience into a narrative. And his inability to place experience into a narrative is part of the crisis in Heart of Darkness. It's part of the information crisis that we see as well. We don't have enough information to generate a narrative out of this experience. So we can just experience it, we can absorb the experience, we can consume the experience, but we can't convert that into a narrative in Heart of Darkness. And that's part of the problem. So if you want to read more about this in more complex cognitive theoretical terms, you can look it up. You can look up my paper, just go to Google, type my name, Abhishek Pari, and write Heart of Darkness. It should show up. It's titled, Do You See the Story? And I think the title paper is Existential and Cognitive Crisis in Heart of Darkness. If you still don't find it, you can write in the forum and my TAs can get back to you. And we can upload it in the forum if need be. But it should be available online. You can download it. I've made it free for everyone to access it. Okay, so this bit when he's, and this is almost like a frustrating, agonized articulation by Marlow when he sort of admits that it seems to me I'm telling you a dream. It seems to me that you're not getting what I'm telling you. I can't put that into a narrative. It is impossible to put my story into a narrative, put my experience into a story, sorry. And then he acknowledges it. So this entire admission of inadequacy, the entire acknowledgement of inadequacy is something which is very important in Heart of Darkness. So in that sense, it's a very modernist novel. It's about stream of consciousness. It's about the mind. Everything is about the mind. The landscape becomes a mindscape, etc., etc. But it also, in many senses, it is also one of the earlier postmodernist novels because it gives you a very good example of unreliable narration. And that unreliability is something which is struggled with in Heart of Darkness. And Marlow himself knows that he, as a narrator, is very, very unreliable and very inadequate. But the only difference between this novel and, let's say, a Salman Rushdie novel, let's say Midnight's Children, which too has an unreliable narrator, by the way, the only difference is attitudinal. There's a difference in attitude. So in Heart of Darkness, Marlow seems to moan the fact that he can't tell the story. He seems to moan the fact that he's an unreliable narrator. There's a degree of lament and moaning that takes place, along with the admission of unreliability. But when it comes to Midnight's Children, when it comes to something like Salim Sinai, which is a character created by Salman Rushdie, in Salman Rushdie's novel, Midnight's Children, that unreliability is celebrated. It's not lamented, it's celebrated. So that centerlessness, which you see in Heart of Darkness, which is a problem, which is a crisis in Heart of Darkness, that becomes a privilege in Midnight's Children. And that's the only difference between a classic postmodernist text like Midnight's Children and an anticipating postmodernist text, an anticipatory postmodernist text such as Heart of Darkness. So the attitudinal difference is what makes the two novels different, despite the structural similarities and functional similarities at the level of narrative. Okay. So he's admitting over here the absurdity of the story, and he's telling you, he's telling the readers as well as the listeners over here, it seems to me I'm trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt. It's like a Sisyphean effort. No matter how hard I try, I can't tell you what exactly took place, what exactly I experienced in Out of Darkness. Because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation. So this whole inability to convert a sensation into a narrative is what is admitted over here. That commingling of absurdity, surprise, and bewilderment in a tremor of struggling revolt. That notion of being captured by the incredible, which is at the very essence of dreams. So it's a combination of absurdity, surprise, bewilderment. So how can you put that commingling, how can you put that entanglement into a logical, realist narrative? Right? So again, among other things, Heart of Darkness is also a novel about the crisis of classic realism as a narrative style. Right, so it's almost like telling you classic realism is breaking up as a narrative style, and we need a new style to tell stories. Okay, so in that sense, it's quite metafictional as well. So it's a classic realist novel about the crisis of classic realism. As a narrative technique, it is inadequate to tell stories about dreams, about psychological situations, which have to account for absurdity and bewilderment. And then he ends by saying it is impossible. So it is an admission of failure. It is impossible to convey the life sensation of any given epoch of one's existence, that which makes its truth, its meaning, its subtle and penetrating essence. It's impossible. We live as we dream alone. Right? So again, this is about the alienation of the storyteller, the loneliness of the storyteller. And Heart of Darkness, in a sense, is about the loneliness of the storyteller. So he comes back as a storyteller. He wants to tell the story of what happened to him in Congo, his experience of suffering, his bewilderment, his absurdity that he consumed, but he can't put that into a narrative. And that becomes part of the narrative problem, but also it almost becomes an existential problem. So again, look at the way in which storytelling and existential locations are entangled with each other in Heart of Darkness. So I stop at this point today and move on to a different passage in the lectures to come. Thank you for your attention.